Hey there everybody, Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and in this week's episode of the Evolutionary Herbalism blog, I want to talk a little bit more about this holistic model that I've been sharing over the last few weeks in regards to medical astrology and its connection to herbal medicine. Last week's episode, I was talking about the way that we can use astrology to look at a person and see the connection between what's going on in their body and their mind and emotions and their spiritual development. And this week, I kind of want to flip it and orient this around plants, right? Not a lot of people are aware that astrology was one of the oldest systems of classification used in Western herbalism, right? That this was one of the ways that plants were seen as having their medicinal and therapeutic properties, that they understood their remedies based on whether it's connected to Mars or to Venus or to Jupiter or to Saturn, as a way of understanding the essence of a plant. And as I've been sharing over the last few weeks, the thing about the astrology is that it is this really holistic system, right? In the way that it sees not just the whole plant or the whole person, but their connection to the whole cosmos, right? To the wholeness of nature. It's really the most holistic model that I can comprehend, because it's looking at the wholeness of life itself and the connections between the various expressions of life. And so in a similar way that we can look at a person on that threefold level, the way last week I was talking about in alchemy, they say that everything in nature is composed of these three philosophical principles of sulfur, mercury, and salt, which relates to the soul, the spirit, and body, respectively, of anything, right? But this also applies to plants. So when we're looking at a medicinal plant, or really any plant, we see that there is a sulfur, a mercury, and a salt within the plant. A soul, a spirit, and a body of the plant. And when we're looking at through this alchemical lens, they say that there's, three very specific physical expressions of those three principles. Say the sulfur is the essential oils of the plant, the most volatile part of the plant. The mercury, or the spirit of the plant, is the alcohol and water soluble chemistry of the plant, the intelligence, the mind of the plant. The salt is in the alkali minerals, the alkali mineral salts, which in the spagyric method of herbal pharmacy, these salts are extracted through calcining or burning the plants down to an ash. But they say that, sulfur, mercury, and salt is the oils, the alcohol or water soluble chemicals, and then the alkali minerals. But looking at sulfur, mercury, and salt from kind of a bigger picture orientation, right? That's kind of looking at the salt, the sulfur, mercury, and salt of the plant, right? Like the physical expressions of those three principles. But on a bigger picture orientation of plant anatomy, so to speak, what we would say is that the salt of the plant is the chemistry of the herb, right? It's all of the physical properties of the plant, how that herb is structured and its morphology and all the physical things about it, right? We would understand from a perspective of herbalism, it's looking at the physical properties of the herb and really looking at the chemistry of the plant. On the mercury level, we're really looking at the energetics of the plant, right? We're looking at its temperature qualities, its moisture qualities, its tonal properties, right? How that herb is an embodiment of its ecosystem, and ultimately how that ecosystem that is embodied within the plant is then conveyed to our own body's ecosystem, right? So that's the energetics, the mercury level of the plant. The sulfur of the plant, we would say, is the soul essence of the plant, or what many people would refer to as the spirit of the plant. It's just very non-physical portion of that herb, right? So when we're looking at a plant through this lens of astrology, the potency of this perspective is that it allows you to see the connections between the physical, the energetic, and the spiritual properties of the herb in a very similar way that last week I was talking about. Astrology allows you to see the pattern of connection between the soul's evolution of a person, their psychological, emotional dynamics, and what's going on in their physical body. So astrology is this very holistic orientation for seeing that connection in the medicinal properties of your plants. And I think this is really important for us as herbalists, because it's really common when we're studying medicinal plants to kind of, I guess, not be able to see those connections, right? This is something I struggled with for a really long time, and it always kind of bothered me, where it was like, like over here, here's all the chemistry and the herbal actions and the organ affinities and what types of conditions and symptoms the herb treats. And then over here, it would be like, okay, well, then here's all the psychological indications, or maybe here's how the flower essence will work on the emotional body and kind of that spiritual development side of things. But they were always like really isolated from one another. And to me, in my perspective of plants, there's an essence in the plant, right? There's a singular medicinal essence within the plant. And it's that singular medicinal essence within the plant that works on the body of the person, that works on the mind of the person, that works on the soul of the person. There's one pattern, right? There's one pattern that affects these different levels of a person, and that is expressed of those different levels in the plant, which really aren't different. They're just different aspects of one thing, right? And so we want to really look at the plants through this holistic level, that we want to be able to see and understand the connection and relationship between the psycho-spiritual properties of an herb and how that's connected to the physical properties of an herb, right? And this is what we see in alchemy. They refer to as, the volatile and the fixed qualities within a plant. The fixed being the physicalness of the herb, and the volatile being the spiritual qualities of an herb. And we're really seeing them as mirror images of one another, right? That the chemistry isn't separate from the spirit of the plant, right? That in alchemy we say that, the chemistry, the chemical properties and constituents of an herb are merely a physical vehicle through which the intelligence and the consciousness of a plant works through, right? It's like their delivery mechanism. In a similar way that we have this physical body that's, composed of our biochemistry and our tissues and all of that. It's a vehicle through which our spirit and our soul are able to be embodied here on this earth. Well, the same is true with the plants. So there's this relationship between plant chemistry and plant spirit. And in that way, I think it's important for us as herbalists to have a cohesive system, a cohesive model that allows us to understand those connections, right? That we have one language, one universal language that ties together the physical healing properties of a plant to its psycho-spiritual healing properties, and allows us to know how we're going to put those together to heal a person, right? Because ultimately that's what the ultimate goal of our work is as herbalists, right? Is to heal someone, to help someone. But a critical thing for us is that we need to understand our remedies. We need to understand our remedies in this greater pattern of wholeness that, to me, is really best understood through astrology. So just to kind of lay out an example for you for what this looks like, and in the old kind of languaging, they say, there's rulerships or correspondences, that there's a plant down here on Earth, that corresponds or is sympathetic to one of these planetary archetypes that exists in the cosmos, right? And I think it's really interesting just looking at the etymology of the word plant, planet. They're come from the same root word, right? And so there's an innate connection between plants and planets, even in the roots of the word. In Paracelsus, the great alchemist, said that plants that grow here on Earth are terrestrial stars, and that the planets out in the cosmos, up in the sky, are celestial plants. That they're the same thing, just one's up there and one's down here, but through that they're connected to one another. So one remedy that I always love to use as an example to illustrate the power of this connection and relationship between astrology and plants is nettles, right? Urtica dioica. And there's so many incredible ways that we see the influence of Mars in the medicine of nettles. So real briefly, Mars, the red planet, is classically attributed to qualities such as, in our mind and in our psyche is kind of like irritability and frustration and anger and violence, kind of on the negative end of the spectrum, but it also represents our willpower, right? It represents our drive, our energy. It's what allows us to act, right? Mars is the force that allows us to move and to act out into the world. So it's this dynamic, expressive, outward kind of energy, but when that gets in excess, it can turn into that irritability and anger and violence and things like that. In medical astrology, Mars rules the blood. And it's very interesting that, Mars is the red planet, our blood is red. Mars rules iron and is full of iron. Our blood obviously is full of iron as well. Mars is classically attributed to medical conditions, including poisoning of the blood. Anytime blood is spilled, like accidents or injury and things like that. Traditionally Mars is said to be representative of that masculine archetype. And so in that way, it also correlates to the male reproductive system. We also see Mars relates to immunity. One of the old ways of really looking at Mars is that it's kind of like the warrior archetype. And the Mars and the sun are kind of connected, where the sun is like the king ruling the kingdom, so to speak. Mars is the warrior that goes out to defend and protect the kingdom. In a similar way that our immune system is designed to protect our body from pathogens, from foreign invasion, so to speak. Mars is this hot, stimulating, irritating quality energetically. And this is where we also see its association with inflammation and irritation of the tissues. These hypersensitivities, patterns of heat are very much so associated with Mars. So those are just to kind of paint the picture of some of the dynamics of this planet. In Ayurveda, we would say Mars is like a pitta quality. In the physiomedicalist tradition, we would say it generates heat excitation tissue states. So now let's take that and let's take a look at nettles, right? So for those of you familiar with nettles, we know that it's intense, right? I mean, the nettles has a very intense physical appearance to it, right? Just the way it's studded with these formic acid crystals that are really sharp and needle-like. Nettles is all about sharpness. It's penetrating and it's sharp, right? And the edges of the leaves are very serrated, right? Almost like a serrated knife. And it has this very intense appearance to it. And then, you touch the nettles and what happens? You get this sharp, hot, irritated, burning rash, right? It gets really red and irritated and intense feeling, right? Those are all Mars correlations. Well, even on a chemical level, nettles is full of iron. Mars is full of iron. Our blood is full of iron. One of the main organ affinities for the leaf of nettle is the blood itself, right? On the one hand, it's nutritive and builds and strengthens blood, but on the other side, it also cleanses the blood as an alterative, right? We use it as a detoxifying agent to cleanse the blood and the liver of metabolic waste products. So it cleanses the blood and also builds the blood. Mars rules the blood. And it's interesting, that you touch nettles and it creates this inflammation on the body, but when you ingest it internally, it's actually very cooling. It's full of chlorophyll. It's very alkaline. And so it actually cools excess heat and irritation and inflammation within the body. So it actually treats an excess of Mars within the body through its cooling properties. The root of nettle is one of our specific remedies to treat the male reproductive system, right? Also ruled by Mars. Another organ correspondence I forgot to mention is the adrenal glands. I was talking about Mars as being this quality of protection, protecting the body through the immune system. But the adrenal glands protect the body too, through that fight or flight response. And so, the old example of there's a bear chasing you through the woods, and it's like that's what stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Your adrenal glands secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, these stimulating hormones that one of the primary effects of those compounds is that it totally shifts the flow of blood. So it moves blood from the core out to the periphery, your arms, your legs, so you can run away or you can kick some ass, right? It's that protection mechanism. It elevates heart rate, it elevates body temperature, it stimulates you, right? And stimulation is a core property of Mars and its physiological response. Now, interestingly enough, the seeds of nettle have a very particular affinity for the adrenal glands, right? I actually remember when I was going to school at Bastyr University in their herbal sciences program, I had a good friend that had learned about nettle seed and heard nettle seed, it can give you a little bit of energy and it works through the adrenals. And she was like, it was finals time, and she was like, oh, I need some energy. I don't want to drink coffee. And so she took I think she put a tablespoon of nettle seeds in a smoothie and drank it down. And she didn't sleep for 2 nights. She was up for 2 whole nights because that nettle seed stimulated her so much. The classic Mars response, right? So we see all these different levels of Mars expressing through nettles, from its morphology to its organ affinities to its medicinal actions to even the different parts of the medicine used. That Mars captures the essence of the plant, right? And that's the thing that I really want to relay to you here, is that it's really common as herbalists to get super overwhelmed studying plants, right? There's a lot to learn. It's all these actions and energetics and organ affinities and their properties and their botany and their chemistry and how do you extract them and what's their dosage, and it's a lot. It's a lot. And to be perfectly transparent, I actually had a really difficult time learning about plants when I first got into herbalism. It was in one ear, out the other. For some reason, I couldn't remember what these plants did. And it wasn't until I was able to see patterns in the plants, right? To not see all these different aspects of a plant as separate. Okay, we have, again, it's that compartmentalizing things that I think our Western minds tend to do, where it's okay, we have the chemistry over here, and we have the actions over here, and the energetics over there, and the conditions and symptoms treated over there. And it's these little different boxes, but they're all aspects of one plant, right? There's an essence in that plant that is attributed to each of those things and weaves those things together. And what the astrology does is it enables you to have a system, an overarching blueprint or framework that each and every property and quality and characteristic of a plant is associated with typically a singular planetary ruler or correspondence. And so when you have the ability to see that pattern in a plant through, again, its morphology and its properties and how it works in the body and its energetics and the conditions it treats, when you can see that pattern and you understand kind of the fundamental qualities and characteristics of the planets, usually you can see that there's a primary planetary archetype that is woven through and stitched into the fabric, the warp and weft of every aspect of that herb. And when you can understand a plant in that way, you really have a much deeper level of connection and relationship and knowledge of that herb. And that really ultimately leads to you being able to administer it to someone much more effectively and much more efficiently. And again, I was talking about nettles there and really looking at all the physical qualities of it. But the thing I didn't mention is that nettles is also really specific for people that tend towards, it's like they've got a short fuse. They're, we have this phrase, they're easily nettled, right? That the smallest thing can trigger this kind of exaggerated response, typically of irritation, frustration, anger. The nettles person typically feels on edge, right? That's like the slightest, you just barely graze them and they're gonna sting you, right? And that's the archetype of the nettles person. It's like they've got this Mars excess pattern in their body, with too much heat and inflammation and irritation, but also in the mind. But what medical astrology shows us is that if someone has an imbalance like that, it really ultimately it's Mars trying to get their attention of like, hey, you need to take my energy, my influence, and express it in a healthier way. Maybe that person had some sort of trauma associated with violence, or maybe they have a hard time with their willpower and their energy, or maybe they need to find a greater purpose that's worth fighting for. That's one way I always like to describe Mars, is that Mars needs a greater purpose, the sun, right? It needs a greater guidance from the sun in order to have something to protect, to defend, to fight for, something that gets you out of bed in the morning and gives you that energy to live for, right? And if we don't have that, oftentimes that Mars force is that energy needs to get channeled, right? And that's usually with an excess of Mars. Sometimes people have a problem with a deficiency of Mars. They're weak and tired and lethargic and they can't get out of bed and they're just, they don't have any of that energy, that vitality, that strength, right? So these are some of the ways that the astrological tool can help you to understand your plants more holistically, right? And to be able to see that connection between their physical, their energetic, and their spiritual properties, so that you can use the whole plant to heal the whole person. And that is why I think medical astrology is awesome, and I think it's one of the most beautiful, amazing tools that we can have in our toolkit as herbalists to understand the essence of the remedies that we love. So thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Evolutionary Herbalism blog. If you're watching this or listening to this anywhere but our website, head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com. We've got lots of free training and videos and downloads there for you, so check it out. If you are not subscribed to our podcast, The Plant Path, be sure to check it out on iTunes or Stitcher, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, all the different ways that you can follow our work and stay up to speed with our free teachings that we offer and our more in-depth training programs. So thanks so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you being here with me. Drop me a comment below. Let me know what your thoughts are on this connection between astrology and herbal medicine and how it can help you as an herbalist. So until the next episode, thanks so much for tuning in. Take care and be well.